Imagine the Taklamakan Desert in the dead of winter, a place where, once upon a time, iron could have melted in the daytime heat, yet at night, that same sand rings with frost, and people's breath crystallizes into ice in the firelight. In this silence, a soft chiming of hundreds of bells on camels' necks suddenly breaks out, and from the dusk emerges a caravan that has been linking distant oases of the Silk Road for centuries. Generation after generation, merchants, pilgrims, and envoys crossed this desert you enter but do not always leave, choosing the winter months to escape the murderous summer heat, only to meet an equally merciless cold. Write in the comments which city you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. That way, you will become a tiny part of a long chain of nighttime stories from the road. Taklamakan lies in the heart of the Tarim Basin, ringed by the Tian Shan and Kunlun Mountains, and since antiquity, it has been one of the most dangerous sections of caravan routes between China, Central Asia, and India. Most routes try to skirt the edges of the desert, moving from oasis to oasis, but sometimes traders dared to cut straight across the sands, choosing a shorter, more direct path, especially when the winter air turned dry and crystal clear, and the dunes froze under a crust of ice. In the travel notes of explorers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you can read how local guides warned them. The main thing is not to underestimate the night cold, because it is more treacherous than the daytime heat. It was the nights that decided whether the caravan would survive, and the way people slept became a matter not of comfort, but of life itself. The size of caravans could be staggering. Sometimes it was just 3 or 4 camels with a single merchant and a couple of helpers, and sometimes the line of animals stretched to many hundreds of heads, in rare cases up to 1,000 pack camels and donkeys. On the major routes north and south of the Taklamakan, sources describe caravans of medium size, several hundred animals with dozens of drovers, guards, and cooks, moving like a slow river through the sands. Crossing the hardest stretches could take weeks of almost continuous movement. Daytime for preparation, night for the road, a short rest, and then the road again, like the very breathing of the desert. And every such day ended with the same ritual, searching for a place where the caravan could survive yet another icy night. When the sun sank behind the line of dunes and the cold crept in so quickly that the air felt like glass, the led guides would look for a raised patch of ground, shielded from the wind by a ridge of dunes or a few scraggly tamarisk bushes. A winter camp could not be set up in low depressions where cold air pooled like an invisible puddle, and where night winds could more easily bury camels and people under drifting dunes. Sometimes they chose a campsite near a dry riverbed or an old well that the veteran caravan men still remembered. But in winter, the water in such places often froze solid to the bottom. That made anything that could offer at least the illusion of shelter all the more important, even if all around there was nothing but an endless desert pale with frost. Once the spot was chosen, a smooth, time-honed ritual of stopping began. The camels were brought closer together and carefully unladen. The bales of silk, tea, wool, porcelain, and spices slid to the ground and stacked in low rows so they could partly shield people from the wind. One by one, the drovers led the animals up to an invisible line and with a practiced jerk on the rope at the base of the neck, made the camels sink to their knees and then lie down, turning their flanks to the wind. Little by little, a living wall rose around the future camp, a circle or oval ring of big, warm bodies behind which the people hid. Those who saw it for the first time later recalled that at night, the caravan seemed to turn into a small fortress, not built of stone, but of breath and wool. Inside this living ring, right there on the sand, the preparations for sleep began. Something that hardly resembled normal rest and looked more like a military bivouac. First, a few men quickly leveled the ground, knocking down the loose top layer of snow and sand so they would not sink in and feel icy voids under their backs. Then, thick felt rugs and mats were spread on the ground, woven in the oases of Kashgaria, and cherished almost as much as the bales of goods themselves, because they cut off human warmth from the eternal cold of the sand. On top of the felt, everyone laid out a sheepskin coat or goat hair fur and heavy camel hair blankets, turning this thin layer under them into the only barrier between the body and the night frost. Merchants almost always slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, long robes of dense wool, padded trousers, and warm boots that they often did not take off completely, only loosening the straps or untying the top laces. Taking off the boots fully meant risking come morning, freezing on the spot while trying to force stiffened leather onto numb feet as the wind sliced at their faces like a knife. The head and face were protected with special care. Over a cap, they wrapped a turban or woolen scarf, leaving only a narrow slit for the eyes so as not to frostbite the cheeks and not to breathe in air that was too cold all at once. By morning, mustaches and eyebrows were often coated with a thin crust of frost, and those who woke up earlier would joke that the night had quietly added gray hairs to them, though the laughter always sounded a little tense. Deep in the Taklamakan, there was almost no fuel, and any fire was an event rather than a routine part of camp life. By day, the drovers gathered saxaul roots and tamarisk shrubs, digging them out of the sand, as well as dried camel dung, the only truly reliable fuel supply that traveled with the caravan the entire way. By evening, from this meager reserve, they built low fires, trying not to let the flames grow too high. Otherwise, the heat would vanish into the sky, and the precious roots would burn out too quickly. At night, thin, almost transparent columns of smoke rose above the camp, and the smell of saxaul and dung soaked into the clothes so deeply that it could be sensed many days later. All night long, specially appointed people stayed by the fires, not only cooks, but also the toughest drovers who knew how to keep the fire alive without wasting a single scrap of fuel. They fed the embers little by little with finely chopped roots and patties of dry dung, making sure that sparks did not leap onto the bales of goods or onto the camel's wool, which could flare up like tinder. The warmth from the fire rarely reached those sleeping in the center of the ring, but simply knowing that there was a fire and that someone nearby was awake gave the night a special, almost home-like sense of safety. At the same time, anyone who stayed by the fire until dawn knew the task was not only to keep comrades warm, but also to notice in time anything that could shatter this fragile world of sleep. The security system of night camps took shape over centuries and reflected the fears and experience of those who had already lost caravans to sandstorms or bandits. In addition to those watching the fire, sentries were posted around the perimeter of the camp, moving between the resting camels and listening to the wind and every foreign sound. They looked not only into the distance at the darkness of the dunes, but also up at the sky, reading it. Fast thickening clouds and a sharp shift of wind direction could signal the approach of a snowstorm or sandstorm. Sometimes these were the first people to feel the faint trembling of the ground from unseen horses and camels in the dark, a sign that another caravan or detachment was moving nearby, and it was not always clear whether their intentions were friendly. Weapons were never put far away at night. Caravan guards and the merchants themselves lay down to sleep with sabers, rifles, or long knives beside them, wrapped in cloth so that the metal would not freeze their hands if they woke with a start. Saddlebags and bales were often arranged to form an extra barrier before the entrance to the camel ring, turning the camp into a kind of maze for an uninvited guest. At the slightest hint of danger, the sentries did not wake everyone at once, but only those assigned to the rapid response. They had to leap up within minutes, saddle several camels, and meet a possible threat at a safer distance. But sometimes the most dangerous enemy was not a human being at all, but the desert itself. When the night wind rose, capable in just a few hours of shifting entire dunes. Before sleep, caravans followed a tradition common to many stretches of the Great Silk Road. A hearty, hot dinner that helped the body retain warmth through the long winter hours. From flour carried in sacks on the camels, they quickly baked flatbreads on the heated walls of cauldrons or on flat stones, sometimes sprinkling them with sesame or poppy seeds if supplies allowed. To go with the bread, they served dried meat, most often mutton, sometimes horse meat, cut into thin strips and cured so that it could withstand weeks on the road without spoiling. Even a small amount of fat in such food meant a great deal. The body processed it slowly, and it released a long, drawn-out flow of warmth, like the night itself. The heart of the evening ritual, however, was hot tea, which in different oases was brewed in its own way. Somewhere they added salt, elsewhere cream, and in some places a bit of butter or milk, turning the drink into a warming soup. The tea boiled in smoke-blackened cauldrons, clouds of steam rising over them and mixing with the smoke of saxaul, so that for caravan people, the fresh scent of tea leaves was forever bound up with the smell of fire and the road. They drank in small sips, warming their palms on hot bowls, and then wrapped themselves tightly in their coats, letting the heat spread through their bodies before lying down between the camels. Many travelers later recalled that these few minutes with a bowl of tea in their hands were the quietest and almost happiest part of a hard day's march. The winter oases, rare islands of greenery along the rims of the Taklamakan, were a longed-for goal for any caravan that had spent weeks of nights out in the sand. In such places, in Hotan, Kiria, Kashgar, and other towns on the edges of the desert, caravans could stay for several days to rest the animals, replenish supplies, and count their bales. Here there were often caravanserais, enclosed courtyards with high mud brick walls, with roofed quarters for people inside, stables for camels, and storerooms for valuable cargo. But rest in these places came at a price. Almost everywhere there were duties and fees to be paid, plus the occasional unofficial exactions by local guards or officials. Spending the night in a caravanserai was different, yet even there, the habits of the desert did not vanish. The merchants slept in their clothes without taking off belts or turbans, covered with the same camel hair blankets and keeping their weapons within arm's reach. Instead of sand beneath them, they had earthen bunks or wooden platforms covered with felt, but many still spread their own small rugs to preserve the familiar feeling of a tiny personal island amid a crowd of people. In the common halls, you could hear several languages at once, Turkic dialects, Farsi, Chinese, and because of that, the sleep felt less deep than in the desert, where the winds howl and the chiming of camel bells merged into one continuous, lulling background. Old caravan men sometimes said they would rather sleep between the dunes to the barking of dogs and the creak of snow than in a warm room where the walls are too close and there are too many human voices. Thus, there emerged a special science of sleep in the Taklamakan, a blend of strict organization, worked out in every detail, and an almost instinctive habit of the body to adapt to cold, wind, and constant danger. In travelers' journals, you can find descriptions of how, in just a few nights, newcomers learn to fall asleep fully dressed without waking from their own shivering, and to wake at the slightest change in the wind or a camel's step nearby. These nocturnal practices were passed down, like the roots themselves, from generation to generation. Where to place the ring of camels, how to arrange the bales, how much tea to drink before bed so as not to freeze and yet not wake up too often. And further on, in the next chapters of this story, it will be possible to listen more closely to the sounds of that very night, to the chiming of bells, the rustle of sand, and the soft voices of people falling asleep in the middle of the desert of death. As the fires flared up and the circle of camels closed tight, the night gradually ceased to be black and instead became softly sonorous. The rhythmic crunch of snow under heavy hooves, the quiet clatter of dishes from late eaters, the rare coughing of men, and above it all, the dull, almost lulling chiming of bells. In such silence, every sound took on weight. But over time, for an experienced caravan man, they all merged into one familiar background, like the roar of a distant sea, under which it was easiest to fall asleep, even in the piercing cold. Travelers noted that it was precisely the repetition of these sounds from night to night that created a sense of order and safety, as if the desert were acknowledging people's right to a tiny island of sleep amidst its dunes. And yet, a little ways off from the fire, there was always someone awake, ensuring this fragile harmony did not shatter from a single wrong rustle. It is amazing how quickly the body adapted to the caravan rhythm. Many newcomers complained in the first few days that they could not sleep on the bare sand, in their clothes and boots, to the howling of the wind. But a week later, they would fall asleep almost instantly the moment they pressed their backs against the warm flank of a camel. Sleep became not continuous but layered, several short drops into darkness, between which a man involuntarily listened to the wind, the stirring of animals, the distant voices of sentries. Old caravan hands used to say that true experience begins when you learn to sleep, as if always half alert, and yet feel not completely broken by morning. This special road style of sleeping was something many kept even at home, starting awake at night at the imagined sound of a camel bell outside the window. Morning in the Taklamakan arrived abruptly. One moment, the sky above the camp seemed bottomlessly dark, and just a few minutes later, a cold, bluish strip of light would emerge in the east, and the stars would pale like coals in a dying fire. The first to wake were those who had stood watch at night. They walked around the circle of camels, shaking the sleepers awake, checking to see if the frost had seized the harness or if the ropes and straps had frozen together. The breath of men and animals turned the inner space of the camp into a veritable ice garden overnight. A thin crust of hoarfrost lay on the felt, bales, and turbans, and near the fire pits lay charred logs turned white with cold. To shake off the numbness, many did not eat at first, but made a few quick movements, rubbing their hands and faces as if trying to wipe away the very memory of the night's immobility. Striking camp was almost as much an art as setting it up. It had to be done before the sun rose high enough to start softening the frozen sand, turning it back into a treacherous mire. Camels were raised one by one using the same short commands and jerks on the lead. And then, speaking little, the men began loading the cargoes onto their backs in a strict order practiced to automatic perfection. Every mistake, a strap tightened wrong, a shifted bale, could mean that by midday the load would list, the animal would tire faster, and the whole caravan would move slower. That is why even the sleepiest eyes gradually cleared when it came time to tighten the girths and check the knots, for the coming night depended on how far they managed to go today. In winter, many preferred to set out while it was still twilight, using the short time of morning cold when the snow and sand underfoot were firm and did not slide apart under hooves. At this time of day, sleep pulled especially hard toward the earth. The body seemed to try to hold on to the warmth of the sheepskin coat and blanket. and the eyes did not want to open fully, while the head still remembered the tight space between camel flanks. But caravan life left no room for sluggishness. After a few winter nights, men and animals seemed to begin sensing one and the same rhythm. Wake, walk, eat, walk again, prepare camp, sleep. In this cycle, sleep became not rest in the usual sense, but a strictly rationed resource that had to be guarded no less than water and fodder supplies. The desert was chosen in winter not out of romance, but out of necessity. Ancient and medieval merchants knew perfectly well that the summer Taklamakan was capable of killing not slowly, but almost instantly, by day. It was hard to breathe through the scorching air. The sand burned hooves and feet, and the nights, though they brought relative cool, remained stifling and heavy, giving the body no chance to truly recover. In winter, however, the air became thin and clear. The daytime heat did not burn out the last of one's strength, but for this one had to pay with long nights when sleep could be broken by any gust of wind or sudden drop in temperature. Thus, the choice of travel time turned into a compromise between two kinds of exhaustion, from heat and from cold, and the caravan men seemed to learn to sleep between these poles. It is interesting that different regions of the Silk Road developed their own schools of road sleep, and the Taklamakan experience was just one of them, albeit one of the harshest. In the high-altitude regions of the Pamirs and Tian Shan, travelers often slept in low stone huts or dry-laid caves without mortar, where felt curtains were drawn at night to hold in the precious heat. There, too, they used thick mats and hides, but the main enemy was not wind and sand, but the thin air, which caused many to wake in the middle of the night with a wildly beating heart and a feeling that they lacked breath. Compared to that, the night cold of the Taklamakan seemed to some merchants even more familiar, though dangerous in its own way. The notes of the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, the Russian traveler Pyotr Kuzmich Kozlov, and members of the Pevtsov and Rurik expeditions show how strongly the nights in these places impressed Europeans. Accustomed to tents and wooden structures, they described in detail how local caravan men preferred to lie right on the sand, believing that the body warms up faster that way from its own breath and the warmth of the camels. To people raised in the tradition of closed rooms and soft beds, this seemed almost unthinkable. But after weeks on the road, many began to seek that very sensation of direct contact with the earth themselves. Thus, through the practice of sleep, European travelers involuntarily joined the 1,000-year experience of the nomads and traders of Central Asia. A special topic is the communal nights in caravanserais, when people from the most diverse ends of Eurasia found themselves in one large hall. Imagine a dim room with thick mud brick walls, where along the walls and in the middle of the hall, rows of sleepers lie on bunks or right on the floor, each on his own rug, wrapped in a sheepskin coat and blanket. The sounds here were different from the desert. Instead of wind and bells, coughing, whispering, sniffling, quiet prayers in different languages, the creak of doors through which a watchman entered from time to time, and still, most merchants preferred to sleep as they were used to in the sands, in their clothes, with a turban on their head, with weapons and valuables literally at their side. In such overnight stays, the social boundary of sleep was especially palpable. Rich merchants tried to occupy the corner, more protected spots, surrounding themselves with bales of expensive goods, while poor drovers made do with the space closer to the doors, where drafts and noise kept them from sleeping deeply. But by morning, everyone woke up equally sleepy and crumpled, with marks from the folds of clothes and coarse felt on their faces, regardless of the thickness of their purse. Sleep, like the road, erased many distinctions, leaving only the division between those who keep watch and those who trust their lives to strangers' eyes at that hour. Recalling such nights, many travelers emphasized that it was in the caravanserais that one felt most acutely how closely fear, fatigue, and the hope for a safe dawn were intertwined. Animals in this common bedroom of the desert played no less a role than people. Camels and donkeys were not only draft power but also a living barrier against cold and attack. At night, a camel laid in the camp circle often ceased to seem a stern working beast and turned into a kind of protective wall, softly wheezing and sometimes grumbling in its sleep. Drovers knew how to guess the caravan's state by sounds. Anxious lowing or restless shifting of animals could hint that someone was walking nearby, or that the weather was changing. It is no accident that many caravan men admitted they slept more calmly by a camel's side than alone under a roof, where walls are silent and do not warn of approaching trouble. The night sky over the Taklamakan became another important part of the bedroom for the caravan. In clear weather, the stars shone so brightly that even without a moon, one could distinguish the outlines of dunes and the silhouettes of camels. Local guides navigated by constellations, determining the direction for the next day and estimating the time until dawn by the position of familiar stars. For many merchants, this sky became an invisible roof, the same over city houses, over fields, and over the desert. But in the Taklamakan, it seemed especially close, as if pulling down the heavy eyelids of the sleepers. To fall asleep under such a dome was at once easy and unsettling. Easy because the darkness did not seem complete. Unsettling because somewhere out there in the dark, threats of the road could be hiding too. The hardest nights were considered those when a storm rose. Then the usual order of sleep collapsed, and all strength was thrown into survival. The wind screwed itself into the camp, packing sand into every crack, lashing faces so that it was impossible to open one's eyes, and people, instead of sleeping, held up covers and felt curtains for hours. Camels were turned tighter into the wind, bales were stacked to work as shields, and people were hidden in the wells formed between the cargo and the animals, where one could at least sit and doze for a few minutes. After such a night, anyone who managed to sleep even a little felt almost happy, regardless of how much sand grit was on their teeth and in the folds of their clothes. Gradually, day by day, such nights accumulated into a special memory of the body. Even years later, many former caravan men would wake up in the middle of winter, imagining the faint ring of a bell or the crackle of saxaul in a fire. Sleep experienced in the desert ceased to be merely a physiological need and turned into a survival experience that etched itself into a biography no less than big trade deals or long marches. When old men told the young about the way through the Taklamakan, they described not only cities and oases but also the overnights, how to lie down correctly, how to wrap the head, how much tea to drink to stay warm and not freeze by morning. Thus was formed that very history of sleep on the road, part of a great centuries-old story of how people learned to live and rest in the most inhospitable corners of the earth. If you listen closely to the murmur of history, a caravan's overnight stay in the Taklamakan is not merely an episode of the journey, but almost a distinct school through which thousands of people passed, linking China, Fergana, Iran, and the distant Mediterranean world. Here, within the ring of camels and under the crackle of saxaul fires, invisible rules were forged, rules known better than any laws of the lands where the merchants were born and to which they returned. These rules were not written in chronicles. They were passed on in whispers by the fire and through gestures before sleep, like a secret cipher recognizable only by those who had at least once fallen asleep between the dunes. And every winter, with a new caravan, this school began its course anew, testing its students with cold and wind. One of the first unwritten rules stated, "One must not sleep closer to the edge of the circle than the men responsible for guarding and the fire." In this way, the campsite itself showed who was most experienced in the caravan and who bore the most responsibility. Young drovers and hired laborers settled closer to the center, in the most protected part of the living fortress, where the risk of a sudden gust of wind or an attack was lower. With age and seniority, a man would conversely shift outward, closer to the fire and the line of camels, where one had to sleep alertly and rise at the first shout of a sentry. Thus, the nocturnal geography of the camp became a kind of map of authority and trust, understood without words. There were also strict, unwritten prohibitions connected with sleep. Do not shout in your sleep. Do not jump up abruptly if you have a nightmare. Do not grab for a weapon at every rustle. In the cramped quarters of the camp, a single frightened shout could rouse dozens of people and spook the animals, which meant chaos, thrown bales, snapping ropes, and the risk of losing part of the cargo. Therefore, older caravan men explained to novices that even in sleep, one must remember those lying nearby and learn to wake up internally first, as if mid-sentence, before opening one's eyes and moving. Gradually, sleep turned into the art of controlling not only the body, but also one's own fear. On the eve of the most dangerous leg of the journey, when the caravan faced several consecutive nights far from oases, many changed their sleep schedule in advance. Men assigned as night sentries began sleeping in bursts while still at the oasis, short stretches during the day and early evening, accustoming their bodies to the upcoming watch shifts. Merchants, on the other hand, tried to get their fill of sleep in the roofed quarters of caravanserais, knowing that in the sands they would have to share the night with worries about the goods and constant supervision of their men. Thus, the transition from room to desert became not abrupt, but gradual, like entering cold water, not in one stride, but in 10 small steps. It is interesting that different peoples walking under the same winter sky of the Taklamakan brought their own habits and beliefs into the common bedroom of the desert. Turkic-speaking drovers might quietly murmur a prayer before sleep, asking for protection from storms and bandits. Traders from Iranian lands recalled verses about the road and fate, echoing ideas about the transience of the world. Those from Chinese regions sometimes hung small knots with protective characters at their heads. All this merged under the rustle of the wind into a quiet chorus in which there was a place for every tone. Even if the languages were different, the very posture of a sleeping person in a sheepskin coat and turban became universal. Sleep on the road also changed one's relationship to one's own body. In cities, merchants could afford soft beds, separate rooms, plenty of blankets and pillows. But here, every extra cover turned into additional weight to be carried across the dunes. So over time, people began to perceive their own body as the main mattress and blanket, learning to preserve heat, economize movement, and find a position in which muscles relax even on coarse felt and uneven sand. Travel notes often remark that the most experienced nomads could fall asleep literally sitting up, leaning against a bale or a camel, and wake up refreshed half an hour later, as if they had spent the night in a bed. To many city dwellers, this skill seemed almost like sorcery. In winter, the campsites on the edges of the desert often hosted not only trade caravans, but also pilgrims, wandering monks, and envoys of various states, and every circle of fire had its own rules of sleep. Pilgrims might lie closer together, leaving space in the center for a small altar or sacred sign to which they turned before closing their eyes. Envoys tried to keep their people separate to emphasize status and guard diplomatic documents and gifts. But the night cold often erased these conventions. In the bitterest frost, people of different ranks involuntarily moved closer to each other and to the common fire. Thus, nature itself reminded them that in the face of the winter desert, all statuses are relative. A special role was reserved for those who could predict the weather by barely noticeable signs, a change in the smell of the air, the behavior of camels, the shape of clouds at sunset. If such a man said in the evening that the night would be especially cold or windy, the sleeping arrangement changed, the guard was doubled, more felt was laid under the sleepers, the circle of animals was closed tighter. Sometimes comfort was sacrificed for this. For example, bales were stacked higher than usual, creating an extra wall, even though this meant it would be harder to get out during the night. Sleep became even more cramped, but the chances of seeing the morning increased. In the beliefs of many nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples of Central Asia, dreams seen on the road possessed special power. They were ascribed the significance of omens connected not so much with personal fate as with the fate of the entire caravan. If someone dreamed of a storm, an attack, or the death of a camel, in the morning they told the elders, and they decided how to treat the vision, as an empty trick of the imagination, or as a signal requiring caution. Sometimes after especially disturbing dreams, they might stay an extra day at an oasis, check the equipment once more, or replace sick animals with stronger ones. Thus, sleep turned out to be not only rest, but also another source of information about the road, albeit not always reliable. On rare winter nights when the caravan stopped near the ruins of ancient settlements on the outskirts of the Taklamakan, the campsite itself added a special dimension to the sensations of sleep. People settled between weathered walls, among fragments of mud brick houses and towers, under which other generations of traders, craftsmen, and officials had once lived and slept. In such places, fires reflected off the unevenness of the walls, and it seemed that someone else, invisible, was warming themselves alongside the living in that flickering light. It is no wonder that many travel notes are full of reflections on how those who walked this same path centuries ago slept and listened to the night wind in just the same way. To an unprepared person, a winter night in the Taklamakan might seem like sheer ordeal, but for regular caravan participants, there was something comforting in it too. The desert set a very simple and clear rhythm. As long as there is a fire, as long as the camels lie in a circle, as long as the breathing of comrades and the ringing of bells are heard nearby, one can afford to close one's eyes. This sense of a common vulnerability shared among all gave birth to a feeling of rare trust, which was sometimes lacking in peaceful and wealthy cities, where walls were thicker, but neighbors were known less well. In this paradox lay the special softness of sleep in the harshest conditions. By morning, when the caravan rose to travel, the memory of the night lived on in every movement for several hours. A hand automatically pulled the turban tighter over the face, as if still expecting an icy wind. A foot stepped more cautiously on the sand, remembering the night's stiffness. A gaze involuntarily scanned the horizon, where the campfire had loomed in the night. Thus, the body continued to carry traces of sleep within itself, just as the road carries traces of hooves long after the caravan has gone. And when, many weeks later, people finally found themselves in warm houses, under a roof, and on soft beds, not everyone could immediately give up the habit of sleeping in clothes with a weapon nearby. The desert, once it had become a bedroom, remained an internal nocturnal landscape within a man for a long time. Gradually, from century to century, these invisible lessons of the overnight stay coalesced into a common tradition that outlived changes of dynasties in China, the arrival of new religions, and shifting political borders along the Silk Road. Goods changed, routes changed. Even the oasis cities themselves could perish and be reborn. But the circle of camels, the felt rug on the sand, the turban wound for the night, and the bowl of hot tea before sleep remained recognizable symbols of the road. For those who today look at old maps and read travelers' diaries, it is precisely these details that make the past alive and almost tangible. And in the next part of the story, it will be possible to step beyond the Taklamakan and see how people slept at other extreme points of the Silk Road, in the mountains, on passes, and even in the holds of sea vessels, continuing this great journey of sleep. Night in the Taklamakan was not lifeless, as it might have seemed at first glance. While people and camels slept, a hidden life of its own continued around the camp. Travelers who happened to stay awake told of nocturnal sounds that seemed especially distinct in the silence. The rustling of small rodents searching for scattered grain, the barely audible flight of night birds of prey, whose eyes saw better in the dark than human ones, and sometimes the distant, drawn-out howl of a wolf, which reminded them that the desert always remained wild territory. Sentries grew accustomed to these sounds and learned to distinguish them from those that portended real danger, such as the quiet footstep of a person or the muffled whinny of a horse. A special part of the world of night camps was made up of dogs, which almost always accompanied large caravans, especially those transporting food or livestock. These animals, often resembling Central Asian shepherd dogs, did not sleep with the people but constantly moved along the perimeter of the camp, listening and sniffing for the slightest changes in the air. Their muffled barking, breaking out in the middle of the night, was the most reliable alarm signal, rousing even the deepest sleepers. Dogs sensed the approach of strangers long before people could spot them, and their very presence often made small bands of bandits bypass the caravan, not risking an open confrontation. Interestingly, the camels themselves also had their own nocturnal language, understood by experienced drovers. Their sleep was shallow, and they often reacted to sounds and smells that humans did not notice. If in the middle of the night one of the camels suddenly began to shift its feet restlessly, snort, or try to rise, this could mean many things, from the approach of a predator to a premonition of a sharp change in weather. The head drover in such a case would go to the animal, calm it, check whether the hobbles had loosened, and at the same time try to understand the cause of the unrest. Thus the animals became not merely a means of transport, but a kind of barometer and alarm system for the night camp. But not all nights in the desert were spent under the open sky. On the southern and northern edges of the Taklamakan, along the main branches of the Silk Road, lay oases where travelers could find shelter in caravanserais. These wayside inns were true fortresses in miniature, high blank walls of clay or unburned brick, a single massive gate that was locked at night with heavy bars, and a spacious inner courtyard surrounded by galleries with rooms for people and stalls for animals. To get inside after sunset was almost impossible, so caravans tried to reach the oases before dark. Sleep in a caravanserai was completely different from sleep in the desert. Here there was no icy wind and no need to sleep in a circle of camels, but other sounds and smells appeared. Instead of silence, the hubbub of dozens of people speaking different languages, the creak of carts, the shouts of drovers, the bleating of sheep, and the neighing of horses. The air was filled with the smells of cooking food, smoke from hearths, dung and sweat, a thick, saturated aroma of life that after the sterile purity of the desert seemed at once both stifling and soothing. Here, there was no need to fear a night attack, but one had to constantly watch one's belongings. as petty theft in the crowding and bustle was a common thing. Rooms in caravanserais, or hujras, rarely amounted to more than small niches in the wall with an earthen floor, sometimes with a raised sleeping platform. They usually had no windows, and light and air entered through the doorway, which at night could be covered with a mat or piece of cloth. Rich merchants could rent several such rooms side by side, placing themselves in one, their guards in another, and the most valuable goods in a third. But most travelers, drovers, small traders, pilgrims, slept all together in common halls or right in the courtyard, spreading their felt rugs on the ground, just as in the desert. Despite having a roof overhead, many of the habits of desert sleep persisted here. People slept in their clothes, covered with the same sheepskin coats and camel hair blankets. Weapons were still laid within arm's reach, and a pouch with money and documents was hidden under the pillow or sewn into the inner pockets of the robe. Even with the opportunity to take off their boots, many did not, remembering that in case of fire or a fight, they would need to jump up and run without wasting time on preparations. Sleep in a caravanserai was safer, but no less guarded than under the open sky. In the morning, life in the caravanserai began even before dawn. The gates creaked, releasing those who were in a hurry to set out. The shouts of drovers gathering their camels rang out. Hearths began to smoke as breakfast was prepared. This morning, chaos was the complete opposite of the quiet, slow preparations in the desert. Here, one had to hurry to buy food, replenish water supplies, check the horseshoes on the horses, and arrange new travel companions, all in a crowd where everyone was rushing about their business. Those who had spent several weeks in the desert often admitted that the bustle of the caravanserai exhausted them more than long crossings over dunes. However, it was precisely in caravanserais that what the entire Silk Road was undertaken for took place. The exchange not only of goods, but also of information. Over evening tea or a morning flatbread, merchants coming from the west told of silk prices in Samarkand, of new duties in Bukhara, of bandits in the passes of the Tian Shan, and those traveling from the east shared news from China, talked about the condition of the roads, about what goods were in demand in Dunhuang or Lanzhou. These conversations were no less important than the goods themselves, because the success of the entire enterprise depended on them, and sleep in such a place was only a short respite in the continuous flow of business and news. In winter, caravanserais were overcrowded. Many traders preferred to wait out the worst frosts and storms in the relative warmth and safety of the oases. At this time, the courtyards were crammed with bales and carts. The stalls lacked space for all the animals, and people had to sleep in heaps, pressing against each other for warmth. But even in this cramping, there existed invisible boundaries. Sogdian merchants stuck together, Chinese officials tried to occupy a separate corner, and Indian pilgrims gathered around their spiritual teacher. The caravanserai was a melting pot of cultures, but even in it, everyone tried to preserve a piece of their own world. But sometimes even the walls of a caravanserai did not save them. Historical chronicles and travelers' notes mention cases when large bands of robbers, having made a deal with someone from the city guard, attacked caravanserais at night, taking advantage of the fact that travelers had relaxed and lost vigilance. Such attacks were rare, but especially brutal, because they caught people off guard in an enclosed space from which there was no path of retreat. The memory of these events made even the most experienced caravan-bashi, caravan leaders, post their own sentries at the gates and on the roofs, not fully trusting the local guards. Thus, alternating nights under the starry sky of the desert and nights in noisy, cramped caravanserais, travelers crossed vast spaces, connecting civilizations. Their sleep was not merely rest, but an important part of a survival strategy, a ritual that helped preserve strength, vigilance, and life itself. Each time they closed their eyes, whether in a circle of camels or on the earthen floor of a hujra, a person made a wager. They entrusted their life to the night, to sentries, to walls, or simply to the warm flank of an animal, hoping that in the morning they could open their eyes again and continue their endless journey. And in this trust, perhaps, lay the main secret of those who made it to the end of the Silk Road. The winter road always led to a single destination, to the oasis, where the mud brick walls of caravanserais promised what the desert could not: a roof, firm ground without ice, and protection. These structures, scattered along the entire length of the Silk Road from the borders of China to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, were not simply hotels, but true nodes of life where the pulse of trade beat even stronger than in city markets. Travelers often called them palaces for all, because behind their gates, for the duration of the overnight stay, many differences were erased between a rich merchant and a simple dervish. Both paid for a spot, both ate the same food, and both depended on the reliability of the bolt on the gates. The architecture of caravanserais was subordinate to one main task: security. So from the outside they resembled fortresses, blank high walls with no windows in the lower section, massive corner towers, and a single entrance that was easy to defend. The gates were made so strong and reinforced with iron that they were impossible to break down with a battering ram, and the narrow passage behind them often had a bend so that a rider could not burst inside at full gallop. Such a design spoke of the harsh realities of the time better than any chronicles. Trade flourished only where stone was stronger than steel. Inside, however, opened up a completely different world, a spacious square or rectangular courtyard, along the perimeter of which stretched arched galleries, creating shade in summer and shelter from snow in winter. In the center of the courtyard, there was invariably a source of water, a well or a hauz, pool, around which life seethed. Here, they watered animals, washed clothes, and performed ablutions before prayer. The courtyard was divided into zones. Closer to the walls, under canopies, lay bales of goods, while the center was often left free for turning carts and camels, which were either driven into special covered stalls for the night or left right there if the caravanserai was overcrowded. Interestingly, the layout of many caravanserais provided for a clear division into clean and dirty zones. On the second floor, reached by narrow stone stairs, were the living rooms, hujras, for people. Small, modest, but isolated from direct proximity to the animals. Below, on the first level, were warehouses, stables, and workshops where one could repair harness or shoe a horse. This vertical division allowed merchants to rest in relative quiet while work with cargo and animals continued below, sometimes not stopping until the very morning. On winter evenings, life in the caravanserai centered around hearths and braziers. Unlike the desert, where fuel was guarded like gold, here one could buy firewood or charcoal and afford a real fire. People gathered in groups, uniting not so much by nationality as by the direction of travel. Those going west looked for fellow travelers and news from those who had just returned from there. In these conversations, deals were born, routes were changed, letters and verbal messages were passed on that might take years to reach the addressee. The caravanserai functioned as a giant information exchange, where the payment for news was often just a cup of hot tea or a handful of dried fruits. A special role was played by the caretakers of caravanserais. Often these were retired military men or former merchants who knew the kitchen of the road from the inside. They not only collected payment for lodging and fodder for animals, but also acted as mediators in disputes, keepers of forgotten items, and even as bankers of a sort, accepting money for safekeeping against a receipt. Their authority within the walls was unquestionable. The word of the caretaker could open or close the gates, permit or forbid trade in the courtyard. In some regions, caretakers were also responsible for the safety of the road on the nearest section, hiring local squads for patrolling. But even the most reliable walls could not completely annul the laws of the road. Here too, under the roof, unwritten rules of communal living applied. For example, it was considered bad form to occupy a spot by the hearth for too long if others were waiting their turn to cook food. One could not make loud noise after a certain hour when most people lay down to sleep before an early departure. Violation of these rules could lead to a caravan simply not being taken as a fellow traveler the next day, and in the desert, solitude was tantamount to death. Thus, the ethics of behavior were shaped by the very necessity of surviving together. Sometimes caravanserais became places of forced, long layovers when passes were blocked by snow or a war began ahead. Then they turned into closed little worlds where people lived for weeks awaiting change. During such periods, wandering performers, storytellers, and healers appeared here, offering their services to bored merchants. Walls built for protection became a stage for small dramas and comedies about which legends were later composed. And many stories of 1001 Nights could well have been born on just such long winter evenings, to the drumming of rain or the howling of wind outside thick walls. For animals, the caravanserai was also a paradise. Here, they were fed better than on the road. Their rubbed backs and bruised legs were treated, and they were given a chance to rest without heavy packs. Experienced drovers knew that a day of rest in a good caravanserai could save 3 days of travel later, because the restored strength of the animal is the speed of the caravan. In large complexes, there were even special pools for bathing camels and horses, which in the conditions of an arid climate was a real luxury. Care for transport here was elevated to a cult no less than care for people. In the morning, when the gates opened, the caravanserai emptied as quickly as it had filled in the evening. Caravans departed, leaving behind only ash in the hearths, footprints on the dusty floor, and the echo of voices. But by evening, everything repeated. New people, new goods, the same questions, where from and where to, the same hopes for a quiet night. This endless cycle of guests made the caravanserai perhaps the most stable element of the unstable world of the Silk Road, a point that always remained in place while everything else moved. In the next block, we will transport ourselves from the comfort of walls back into the cold, to the mountain passes of the Pamirs and Tian Shan, where caravans faced altitude, avalanches, and thin air, and we will learn how they slept where it was difficult even to breathe. If the stones of ancient caravanserais could speak, they would tell thousands of stories about nocturnal fears and morning hopes. But now, they keep a silence that has itself become part of their legacy. Today, tourists arriving in Khiva, Bukhara, or the ruins of ancient cities in Xinjiang can enter the very same courtyards where caravans once stopped. But instead of the neighing of horses and the shouts of drovers, they are met only by the echo of their own footsteps. This silence is deceptive. It is filled with the memory of millions of people whose fates intersected at these points, creating an invisible but durable network of cultural and human ties. A modern traveler, staying for the night in a restored caravanserai, can only attempt to catch that old rhythm of life when sleep was not just rest, but a short pause in the battle for survival. It is amazing how architecture created solely for utilitarian purposes, the protection of goods and people, turned into a monument to human resilience and ingenuity. Massive portals decorated with complex brickwork or majolica were not merely decoration, but a sign of the power and wealth of a state capable of ensuring safety on its roads. Looking at these majestic entrances today, it is easy to forget that behind them lay a world of hard physical labor, filth, the smell of manure, and constant tension. We romanticize the past, seeing in caravanserais the palaces of Eastern fairy tales, but for their inhabitants, they were primarily rescue stations in an ocean of dangers. Modern archaeological and restoration projects, supported by UNESCO, try to preserve not only the stones, but also the spirit of these places. Although this is a task of incredible complexity, how to convey the atmosphere of a night bazaar in Tabriz, where trade still goes on under the vaults of the ancient market, but with completely different goods. Or how to explain to a visitor of an open-air museum in Merv that this hill of melted clay was once a wall behind which hundreds of people hid from the winter blizzard. Often, it is in the silence and emptiness of ruins that the imagination paints the most vivid pictures of the past, rebuilding destroyed arches and lighting imaginary fires. The legacy of the Silk Road is not only the buildings, but the routes themselves, which, like scars or old riverbeds, cut through the landscape of Eurasia. Even today, when asphalt highways and railway lines are laid along these paths, the logic of movement remains the same, from water source to water source, through passes where there is less snow, and valleys where there is protection from the wind. Drivers of modern long-haul trucks crossing the same deserts and mountains face similar problems. Where to stop for the night, how to keep the warmth in the cab, where to eat safely. Technologies have changed, but the essence of the road, as a space of risk and overcoming, has remained the same. It is interesting to observe how old traditions of hospitality, born in caravanserais, sprout in the modern culture of the countries of Central Asia and the Middle East. The habit of offering a guest tea right from the threshold, the arrangement of common guest rooms where people sit on the floor on kurpachas, cotton mattresses, the special respect for the traveler, all these are echoes of those times when life depended on whether you would be let in for the night. A guest is from God, they say in the East, and this phrase has a very concrete historical weight, paid for by centuries of difficult roads. These unwritten laws turned out to be stronger than mud brick walls. The Silk Road today is also a powerful symbol of globalization that existed long before the appearance of the internet and airplanes. People falling asleep in caravanserais side by side, a Chinese next to a Persian, a Sogdian next to an Indian, were the first citizens of the world who learned in practice to understand each other without dictionaries. In their dreams, gods of different religions mingled, and in their bags, coins of different mints. This experience of peaceful, albeit forced coexistence in the enclosed space of a night lodging is more relevant today than ever. It reminds us that trade and dialogue have always been the best way to overcome fear of the alien. In our days, the revival of interest in the Silk Road leads to the appearance of new forms of tourism, where people seek not the comfort of five-star hotels, but precisely that real experience. Yurt camps have appeared in the deserts of Uzbekistan and China, where tourists are offered to spend the night as their ancestors did, on felt under the stars, listening to songs by the fire. Of course, this is only a stylization. Modern caravan men have warm sleeping bags, GPS navigators, and support vehicles. But even such a game allows one for a moment to touch that great silence of the desert, which was once the merchant's only companion. Concluding this block, I would like to say that the history of caravans is not only a history of goods, silk, and spices. It is, above all, a history of people who every night performed a small feat. They lay down to sleep in the unknown, entrusting their lives to fragile walls or the warmth of a fire in order to rise again in the morning and take one more step to the west or to the east. Their sleep was the fuel for the movement of civilization. And in the following chapters, we will see how this impulse of movement pushed people even further into the icy embrace of high mountain passes where every breath was a battle and sleep could become eternal. It is a strange thing. Ancient caravan routes have long ceased to be the main arteries of trade. Goods now fly through the air and sail across the seas in containers. But the memory of that era has not only not faded, but has turned into a powerful cultural magnet. A modern tourist buying a ticket for the In the Footsteps of the Great Silk Road tour seems to be groping for something elusive, perhaps the sense of authenticity that is so lacking in the sterile world of hotels and airports. He wants to feel like part of that endless movement that once connected half the planet not with wires and satellites, but with the steps of camels and human tenacity. And in this desire, there is something touching, an attempt to return the meaning of a journey to sleep, rather than just the function of restoring strength between museums. The modern tourism industry quickly realized that one can sell not only architectural monuments, but also the very atmosphere of the road. Routes have been developed across Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, where tourists switch from comfortable buses to camels, spend the night in yurt camps where pilaf is served in real cauldrons, and in the evening, to the sounds of the dutar, legends about merchants and bandits are told. Of course, this is theatricalization. The camels walk along strictly marked paths. The yurts are equipped with electricity, and there is always a sanitary block with a shower nearby. But even in this stylization, one can see a longing for a simple and understandable world where the value of an overnight stay was measured not by stars in a rating, but simply by the presence of a roof and warmth. It is interesting to observe how the very concept of overnight stay has changed on tourist routes along the former Silk Road. In Samarkand and Bukhara, old caravanserais have turned into boutique hotels where, for thousands of dollars, one can spend the night in the very hujra where merchants once slept on felt. Now, instead of felt, there are antique carpets instead of a sheepskin coat, an air conditioner instead of sentries, an electronic lock, but the walls are the same. And if you listen at night, you can almost hear the creaking of carts and the distant ringing of bells, although, most likely, it is just the noise of cars outside the window. Tourists pay for the illusion of immersion, and this is also a kind of heritage. Like the merchants of the past, the modern traveler buys the right to a safe sleep in a foreign place. Parallel to commercial tourism, another direction is developing: archaeological and scientific interest in how people actually lived on the Silk Road. Expeditions excavate the ruins of caravanserais, investigate the remains of hearths, study the skeletal remains of camels and horses, trying to reconstruct the diet, methods of treating animals, routes, and even travel schedules. The archaeology of sleep is a young discipline, but it is already yielding interesting results. DNA analysis in ancient fabrics shows where travelers came from, and the study of skeletal wear speaks of chronic sleep deprivation and constant physical strain. History ceases to be a set of beautiful legends and becomes the history of specific bodies, specific pain, and fatigue. It is curious that in the countries of Central Asia, there is also a reverse process. Local residents, whose ancestors served caravans for centuries, themselves become tourists in their own land. Young residents of Bukhara or Khiva often admit that they first visited the ancient monuments of their city only after they were included in the UNESCO list, and foreigners began to flock there. Globalization caused a strange effect. To see the value of one's own past, it was necessary for it to first be appreciated by strangers. And now an Uzbek or Tajik schoolchild listens to a guide telling how his great-grandfathers slept on felt with the same surprise with which a European tourist learns about the life of medieval knights. The Silk Road today is also a great geopolitical metaphor. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative directly appeals to the historical memory of trade caravans, offering a new version of continental connectivity. Railways, highways, and fiber optic cables are laid along the same corridors where camels once walked, and politicians like to talk about the revival of the Great Road. But to be honest, modern freight flows bear little resemblance to those slow caravans. Now, no one stops to light a fire and spend the night under the stars. Speed has killed the ritual, and perhaps that is why tourists are so drawn to its imitation. They intuitively feel that they have lost something important. In the educational programs of many countries in the region, courses dedicated to the history of the Silk Road have been introduced, and it is interesting what emphasis is placed in them. In China, they like to emphasize the technological contribution, the invention of gunpowder, paper, and the compass, which spread around the world precisely through these roads. In Iran and Uzbekistan, the emphasis is on cultural exchange, on how the meeting of Persian, Turkic, and Chinese traditions gave birth to unique forms of art and architecture. And in Russia, in recent years, they have been trying to fit the northern branches of the path through the Volga region and Siberia into the general picture, proving that the Great Road passed not only through hot deserts. Each country seeks confirmation of its significance in this heritage, and the sleep of the caravan man becomes a field of cultural and political competition. But there is another side. Hundreds of thousands of modern migrants who go to work from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan to Russia, from China to Kazakhstan, repeat the same logic of movement as ancient traders. They also spend the night in roadside hotels, sleep in train cars and truck cabs, also save money and fear robbers. Now these are corrupt policemen and scammers. Their path is less romanticized. They are not written about in tourist brochures, but they are the living continuation of that tradition when sleep on the road was not an adventure, but a forced necessity. And if you think about it, the legacy of the Silk Road is not only museums and caravanserais, but also these countless trains, buses, and hostels where people fall asleep with one thought: when will I be able to return home? Concluding this block, one can say that sleep on the Silk Road did not end with the last caravan. It simply changed form. Now, it is a night in the car of the Tashkent-Moscow train. It is a nap in the waiting room of Almaty Airport. It is a short rest of a trucker in a parking lot somewhere between Urumqi and Kashgar. The road still demands sacrifices, and sleep is one of them. In the next part, we will go where the road becomes almost impossible, to high mountain passes where every breath counts, and sleep can be the last. If the Taklamakan was a trial by sand and thirst, then the mountain passes of the Pamirs and Tian Shan became a trial by altitude, where the very air seemed to reject the presence of man. Caravans that survived the desert were forced to ascend to heights of 3,000 or 4,000 meters along narrow ledges carved straight into the rock, where a single misplaced hoof of an animal could cost a life. Here, in the realm of eternal snows, the rules of sleep changed radically. One had to sleep not just in the cold, but in conditions of hypoxia, when any movement in sleep could cause a fit of suffocation. Travelers described this state as sleeping with open eyes. The body lies motionless, but the mind races in anxiety, finding no peace. Preparation for the overnight stay in the mountains began long before sunset, because with the arrival of twilight, the temperature dropped instantly, and the wind intensified to storm force. Unlike the desert, where one could hide behind the body of a camel, here the animals themselves needed protection. They tried to drive them into natural recesses in the rocks or behind walls of stones piled up by previous travelers. If there was no shelter, the camels were placed close together, and the people were placed between them, covered from above with felt blankets, creating a kind of sandwich in which warmth was preserved only at the expense of crowding. But even such a measure did not always save them. Morning rounds often revealed animals frozen to death standing up. The most terrible enemy on the passes was mountain sickness, from which both people and animals suffered. Sleep at altitude became dangerous. In a horizontal position, pulmonary edema developed faster. So many caravan men preferred to sleep half-sitting, leaning against bales. Breathing during sleep was heavy, intermittent, often accompanied by groans that merged with the howling of the wind into an eerie symphony. Experienced guides periodically woke people up, forcing them to take several deep breaths or drink hot water to get the blood moving. Here, sleep was not a right. It was a privilege of those who had a strong heart. Fire in the high mountains was a luxury almost unavailable. Trees did not grow there, and the dried dung brought along burned poorly due to the lack of oxygen. Often they had to be content with raw food or rusks soaked in ice water, which added no warmth to the body. The absence of a hot dinner made the night especially agonizing, for without an internal source of heat, no sheepskin coat could warm one completely. In such conditions, people slept huddled in a heap, disregarding ranks and estates. The merchant warmed the drover's back, and the drover, the guard's feet. Common misfortune equalized everyone more strongly than any philosophical teachings. Night sounds in the mountains differed from those of the desert. Here the roar dominated. Periodically, rockfalls broke loose, ice cracked on glaciers, and avalanches came down with a dull rumble resembling distant thunder. The echo in the gorges amplified any sound many times over, creating the illusion that the mountains were talking. Superstitious caravan men believed these were the voices of mountain spirits demanding tribute, and before sleep they left pieces of bread or cloth on the stones, hoping to buy themselves a quiet night. For European travelers, these sounds were a source of constant tension that did not let them relax for a minute. On the passes, there also existed special rescue stations, windowless stone huts built by local rulers or wealthy merchants for charity. Inside it was dark, dirty, and cramped, but at least the wind did not blow. The floor in such shelters was covered with a layer of straw and manure accumulated over decades, but tired travelers fell onto it as if onto a featherbed. However, there was danger here too. Smoke from the hearth, which had nowhere to go, ate at the eyes and lungs, adding torment to the already difficult breathing. Often the choice stood thus: either freeze in the clean air or suffocate in the warmth. Morning in the mountains brought not relief, but new anxiety. It was necessary to descend along icy paths that had become even more slippery overnight. Sleepy, stiff people struggled to tie knots and saddle animals. Camels, sensing danger, roared and refused to get up. They had to be raised with shouts and blows. This morning, conflict of man and animal, played out on the edge of the abyss, was perhaps the most dramatic scene of caravan life. But it was precisely after overcoming the passes, when the caravan finally descended into the green valleys of Fergana or Kashmir, that sleep acquired a completely different quality. The first night down below, in warmth and with a normal amount of oxygen, people slept like the dead, sometimes for 12-14 hours straight, making up for what was lost over weeks of travel. This drunken sleep was a reward for the fear and cold endured, and the locals knew one should not wake a caravan man who has come down from the mountains until he opens his eyes himself. His soul needs time to return to his body. When the caravan having survived the Taklamakan and the high passes, finally emerged near the great cities on the edge of the continent. The road seemed to change its breath. Instead of the whisper of sand and the dull roar of avalanches, there appeared the distant hum of human voices and markets. These cities, from oasis centers in East Turkestan to port hubs on the coasts of the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf, became points where the overland Silk Road met maritime routes. Here, cargoes that had passed through deserts and mountains were transferred from camel packs into warehouse bales and barrels, prepared for the sea crossing that was to link Asia with the coasts of Arabia, East Africa, and the Mediterranean. For merchants, this meant not only a change of transport, but also a change of lodging. From the starry sky of the desert to the low ceilings of warehouses and holds, by the Middle Ages, large hub cities in the oases of Central Asia, on the coasts of Iran and India, already had entire quarters adapted specifically for transit caravans, warehouses, customs yards, caravanserais near markets. Here, unlike the quiet desert inns, the night was filled with different sounds. The creaking of dock gates, the clatter of barrels on stone slabs, the calling of porters dragging bales that had come all the way from China or Fergana. Sleep became shorter and more anxious. One had to manage to clear customs, check seals on bales, negotiate with ship owners, and many merchants fell asleep late at night, right on their rugs in the corner of a warehouse, not leaving their goods. The city provided a roof, but it did not give that deep darkness and silence to which they had become accustomed under the stars of the Taklamakan. Caravanserais in such cities differed from those standing in desert oases. They pressed closer to trading rows, warehouses, and the harbor, turning into part of a single mechanism of goods movement. In their courtyards in the evenings, one could hear not just the talk of caravan men, but also the restrained arguments of ship owners, negotiations with customs collectors, and the reading of documents in different languages. The same multilingual crowd slept here as deep in the continent, but a new background was added to the night voices of the desert. The smell of salt, seaweed, and tar, with which the air of the port quarters was soaked. For those who came from the arid regions of Central Asia, this humidity seemed almost a miracle. But at night, it brought a new problem. The damp, cool breath of the sea chilled no less than the dry frost in the desert. Sleep in a port caravanserai became transitional. The body still remembered the rhythm of the desert and mountains, while maritime trade laws already operated around it. Merchants, out of habit, spread felt rugs, covered themselves with sheepskin coats and camel blankets, although locals sometimes looked at this with a slight smile, offering thin cotton covers more familiar to the warm climate. But road habits proved stronger. A man accustomed to falling asleep with a turban on his head and a knife or saber under his hand rarely parted with this ritual even in the city, where walls were made not of dunes, but of stone masonry. Thus, different cultures of lodging coexisted in the same room: nomadic, urban, maritime. The maritime branch of the Silk Road, written about in chronicles of the Indian Ocean and China, added another type of night to this story: nights on ships. In the ports of South and Southeast Asia, on the coasts of China and the Arabian Peninsula, cargoes were transferred from camels onto multi-masted vessels, and merchants had to change not only the environment, but the very mechanics of sleep. Instead of motionless sand, pitching, instead of a circle of camels, a cramped hold or between-deck space where sleepers lay in rows on mats between bales of fabrics, spices, and ceramics. At night, the ship became a new caravanserai. Only its walls were wooden, and the floor was alive, moving. Sleep in the hold differed from sleep on the ground, primarily in that the body never lay in complete stillness. The ship breathed, swayed, creaked, and this movement was transmitted to the sleepers. Contemporaries described how in the semi-darkness between beams and bales, a quiet hum was heard, a mixture of snoring, whispered prayers, creaking rigging, and water splashing against the side, creating a strange lullaby to which even the most anxious heart eventually grew accustomed. Merchants slept, as in the desert, in their clothes, often without taking off their shoes, and kept valuables and documents either in their belts or under their heads, turning a bale of goods into a pillow and a safe at the same time. Here there was no longer a camel's living wall, but there were thick sides and hope in the captain's ability to read the stars and winds. Unlike desert nights, where the main enemies were cold, bandits, and sandstorms, at sea, merchants learned to sleep under the threat of storms. Monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean determined the seasonality of voyages, and those who were late to port risked spending long weeks in pitching seas when sleep turned into a series of short lapses between bouts of seasickness. Chronicles note that many traders tried to plan their route so as to cross the desert and mountains precisely in the cold season, and to reach the ports in time for the beginning of favorable winds, combining the schedule of sleep with the schedule of nature. Thus, the old science of the road included climatic tables, observations of the sky, and simple human memory of how it is easier to fall asleep in the cold or in the rocking. It is interesting that in surviving documents, from receipts and contracts to travel notes found, among other places, in the archives of Dunhuang and other cities on the Silk Road route, mentions of lodgings, stops, and rest times appear regularly. Where today a road map says hotel or parking, ancient merchants noted a caravanserai, an oasis, a reliable house by such and such bridge, a pier. These dry lines stayed for the night, waited for a fair wind, gave rest to the animals, actually hide whole worlds of sleep. Saxall fires, cramped mountain huts, noisy city courtyards, rocking decks. Researchers are increasingly paying attention to these everyday details as a key to understanding how people experience the road with their bodies, and not just with money and contracts. If you look at the entire Silk Road as a long chain of overnight stays, you get an amazing picture. From the icy stars over the Taklamakan to the humid warmth of port cities, from sun-scorched caravanserais to the dark holds of ships. In each of these places, a person tried to arrange a small island of safety for himself, to lay out things in a certain way, cover himself with the same blanket, repeat a familiar gesture before sleep. These rituals were common to nomads, farmers, sailors, merchants, and pilgrims, and it was through them that different cultures learned to understand each other. An invitation to share a fire or a mattress in a caravanserai meant more than 100 polite words. Night became the universal language of the road, and perhaps the quietest thought that goes through the centuries from camel bells to modern trains and airplanes is that every traveler at some moment found himself in the position of the viewer of this video. He lay down, listened to distant sounds of the wind, the sea, the city, and thought about whether he would live until morning and where the next day of the journey would lead him. Now, falling asleep in his room, a person hears not the ringing of bells, but the noise of technology or the city. But the essence does not change. Sleep remains a thin bridge between the road traveled and what lies ahead, and, imagining the circle of camels in the winter desert of the Taklamakan, the cramped mountain hut, and the rocking ship's hold, one can feel that one's own night is just one line in the huge, centuries-old history of how people learned to sleep in the most diverse places and still keep going. Several centuries have passed since the last large camel caravans crossed the Taklamakan, and today, instead of the ringing of bells, Only the drone of off-road vehicle engines and the sound of the wind over the desert are heard in these places. The Silk Road as a living artery of trade did not fade in a single day, but slowly, as the world changed, the opening of maritime routes in the 15th and 16th centuries, the intensification of political instability in Central Asia, the shifting trade priorities of empires, all this step by step took away the caravan's significance. By the 19th century, large trade caravans became a rarity, and by the middle of the 20th century, they had definitively turned into a memory, a legend, an object of research for archaeologists and ethnographers. Not only did the road disappear, but also that special culture of sleep which had formed over centuries in its rhythm. It is interesting that the end of the caravan era did not mean the end of movement itself. Trains, cars, and airplanes replaced camels, but the essence remained the same. People still cross the same geographical spaces, only now it takes hours, not months. However, one thing changed fundamentally. Sleep ceased to be an organic part of the journey. On the Moscow-Beijing train, a passenger can sleep the entire way in a compartment, hardly feeling the reality of the distance that once demanded from his ancestors months of vigilance and thousands of small decisions about where and how to lie down for the night. Sleep became a comfort, not a necessity and a risk. This transition, from sleep as part of survival to sleep as part of service, is perhaps one of the most unnoticed but profound changes in human history. Many organizations, from UNESCO to National Institutes of Central Asian countries, are trying to preserve the cultural heritage of the Silk Road today. Dozens of caravanserais, ancient cities, and road fragments have been included in the World Heritage List. And each of these objects is a silent witness to thousands of nights spent there by travelers. But how to preserve not the stone, but what happened inside that stone? How to convey the feeling of a night when the wind howled outside the wall, and inside the semi-dark hall lay people wrapped in sheepskin coats, each carrying their own story, their own fear, their own hope. Museums and reconstructions can show objects, felt rugs, copper kettles, old saddles, but they cannot reproduce the smell of Saxol smoke, the heaviness of fatigue after a 10-hour march, and that special silence that descends when the caravan stops and people finally lie down. Modern researchers are increasingly turning to intangible heritage, oral traditions, songs, and rituals that accompanied life on the road. In Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and other countries of the region, the memories of the last descendants of caravan men who still caught those times when their grandfathers led camels are being recorded. These stories are full of details about how the overnight stay was prepared, what prayers were recited before sleep, how watches were distributed by the fire. Gradually, an oral history of sleep is emerging, which complements archaeological finds and written sources. And it turns out that sleep was not just a break in the journey, but a whole world with its own rules, superstitions, songs, and even humor. Parallel to scientific research, an attempt to revive this tradition through tourism is developing. Travel companies offer overnight stays in yurts, in deserts and steppes, stylized caravan dinners by the fire, even short camel treks with an overnight stop in conditions as close as possible to historical ones. Of course, this is theater. The modern tourist always knows that in case of anything, a support car will pick him up, that he has a satellite phone and a first aid kit. But even this game of the past gives something important. It returns to a person the feeling of vulnerability, dependence on nature, that very feeling that caravan men experienced falling asleep under the stars. And many admit that this very night in the desert, when they lay on felt listening to the wind, becomes the strongest impression of the entire tour. stronger than any palaces and mosques. There is a sad irony in this story. What was once a forced necessity has become an expensive entertainment. Merchants paid for a safe overnight stay in a caravanserai with copper coins, and now tourists pay hundreds of dollars for an imitation of danger. But perhaps it is in this inverted logic that the value of what was lost manifests itself. We begin to understand what we have lost only when it turns into a rarity. Modern man, immersed in a world of artificial light, climate control, and constant connection, yearns for that simplicity when the boundaries of day and night were clear, when sleep came naturally from fatigue and not from a melatonin pill. It is interesting that in the countries through which the Silk Road passed, some traditions directly related to caravan culture are still alive. The habit of spreading kurpashas, cotton mattresses on the floor, and sleeping not on beds, but on the floor or low platforms. The tradition of taking off shoes before entering a living space. The ritual of evening tea drinking, which sets the boundary between day and night. All these are echoes of that time when home was not a building, but a circle of light by a fire. Even in modern apartments in Tashkent or Almaty, one can meet families who spread thin mattresses on the floor for the night and put them away in the morning, turning the room back into a daytime space. This mobility of sleep, coming from nomadic and caravan tradition, persists despite urbanization. Returning to the beginning of our narrative, to the winter nights in the Taklamakan, to the circle of camels, to felt rugs and turbans wound around faces. One can say that this story ended not because people stopped traveling, but because the very nature of the road changed. The road no longer demands complete immersion from the traveler. It does not dictate the rhythm of sleep and wakefulness. It has become a background that can be slept through or scrolled through on a phone. And perhaps the main legacy of the Silk Road is a reminder that once the road was not a means, but a meaning, and sleep on it, not a break, but part of life itself. For those watching this video while getting ready for bed, the caravans of the Taklamakan can become something like a lullaby from the past. Imagine that you are lying not in your bed, but on felt between camels, that above you is not a ceiling, but a bottomless starry sky, that nearby people are breathing, speaking unfamiliar languages, but connected to you by one road. This image can help you fall asleep because it returns sleep to its ancient simplicity. To close one's eyes, not from boredom, but from fatigue. To entrust oneself to the night, not out of habit, but out of necessity. And to wake up in the morning, not by an alarm clock, but because the sun has touched your face and the road calls forward again. Good night. May your sleep be as deep as that of a caravan man who has reached an oasis after a week in the desert, and as light as the morning wind over the dunes of the Taklamakan.